Okay, good afternoon and welcome to this webinar organized by FEPS, the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, under the title, What's Next for Belarus? My name is Laszlo Andor, I'm the Secretary General of FEPS, and I would like to welcome you all. Especially, I would like to welcome our panelists. May I introduce them immediately? Dr. Anais Marin, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in Belarus. Mr. Robert Biedroń, who is a member of the European Parliament, head of the Polish delegation, and also chair of the Delegation for Relations with Belarus. And last but not least, Professor Katarzyna Wolczuk, professor of East European politics at the Center for Russian, European, and Eurasian Studies at the University of Birmingham. Thank you very much for joining us. Since August, I believe we have been watching the developments in Belarus with a lot of excitement and expectations. We have seen similar uprisings, if I may use this expression, especially following general elections that probably were not up to the standards which we would like to see in Europe. However, let's be honest, Belarus is a country which, despite sharing a border with the European Union, is somewhat isolated. Very few of us personally visited Belarus. Our knowledge is limited. FEPS would like to help. First of all, help with the understanding. And that's also why we organized this webinar. And also our publication, The Progressive Post, recently published a dossier of articles in order to present a consistent analysis about why these developments erupted in August 2020 and who are the participants, who are the key players, what are the main social, economic, and political trends which we can detect in this period. But I think the intention for us also goes beyond the analysis, because whenever we see a fight for freedom, we, of course, have to extend solidarity. And the expression of sympathy also has to be accompanied with the intentions to help somehow to make social and also political development towards what we call European standards. But I should also stop here and as soon as possible give the floor to our invited speakers who will highlight and explain specific aspects of the current situation in Belarus. Before inviting the first speaker to intervene, however, let me explain that this Zoom event is to some extent interactive. In the chat box, in the Q&A parts, you can contribute with questions, and at the after the panel, we will raise these questions towards our distinguished panelists. So first of all, may I ask Dr. Marin, representing the United Nations in this panel, to share with us her analysis of the situation in Belarus from the point of view of human rights.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for the invitation. Let me stress that I don't represent the United Nations. I'm sorry. As an independent expert appointed by the Human Rights Council, my views are my own and don't represent those of the UN. This said, so my assessment of the situation in Belarus is that it has never been, well, good for the past 26 years. But since my mandate was established in 2012, it has never been as catastrophic as it has been in the past 6 months. It is all the more worrying as it continues to deteriorate. Already before the start of the presidential campaign, a number of fundamental freedoms have been trampled upon, notably the right to freedom of opinion and expression, and the right to participate in public life, including the right to freedom of peaceful assembly. Altogether, no less than 28,000 people have been arbitrarily detained since August for expressing dissenting views, and participating in protests throughout the country, although these were largely peaceful. This is almost 30 times more than in 2011, when the last contested elections were followed by harsh repression too. Back then, half a dozen opposition leaders, including presidential candidates, ended up behind bars. This year, and in a rather unprecedented way, two of the most serious contenders were arrested already before the start of the campaign. They're still in custody, while a third one was pushed to exile. Whereas the historical opposition leaders have been somehow absent from this campaign, new opposition figures have emerged who have also been targeted by repression in one form or another, either by being forced to leave the country or being charged for allegedly threatening national security. In a nutshell, I would say that the human rights violations which raise the most serious concerns out of many others, which have been systemic in Belarus for several decades, are threefold. Firstly, I'm concerned about reported cases of torture. According to some NGO sources, at least 2,000 complaints for violence, torture, cruel or other ill treatment have been lodged since August. These allegations have been duly documented and reported, notably by Professor Wolfgang Benedek in the report he presented 1 month ago to the OSCE after 17 participating states launched the so-called Moscow mechanism and asked him to assess the situation. Other reputable organizations, such as the Organisation Mondiale contre la Torture and Amnesty International, have alerted on the problem, highlighting that these crimes were committed by or attributable to police and security forces who were acting in an organized and premeditated way. Let me remind about the absolute prohibition of torture, which is an axiom of international human rights law, meaning that no exception can be accepted, defended, justified, or tolerated in any circumstance whatsoever. From the information I have, no criminal investigation has been opened yet on those crimes in Belarus. Neither have prosecutors considered appropriate to open cases into allegations of enforced disappearances or death. Yet victims have a right to judicial redress, and perpetrators must be held accountable for their crimes and brought to justice. Rubber stamping such serious and massive human rights violations is totally unacceptable. My hope now is that an international investigation into these crimes be launched sooner than later. Meanwhile, pursuant of the jus cogens principle, everyone has moral responsibility to address the problem. And I have indeed heard of several initiatives that could lead foreign criminal courts to exert universal or extraterritorial jurisdiction to investigate these crimes and prosecute perpetrators in absentia. The activation of these mechanisms could help deter the perpetrators from continuing this practice. This problem of impunity is tightly connected with the second issue. No thorough, independent, and impartial investigation into human rights violations is possible under the current circumstances in Belarus because of the systemic deficiencies in the administration of justice. This is what I highlighted in my last report to the UN General Assembly. In Belarus, the judiciary is not independent. Prosecutors, judges, and even lawyers operate under tight control of the executive branch of power, which interferes with the administration of justice for political reasons. The fundamental rights of the defense, such as the right to a fair trial, presumption of innocence, and access to lawyers, are systematically violated. Moreover, in recent months, lawyers who defend protesters or human rights defenders have been targeted by repression as well. Several of them have been disbarred, and some are even facing criminal prosecutions, apparently on trumped-up charges. Cynically enough, whereas violations into torture crimes are not being investigated, protesters are targeted by judicial harassment. At least 900 of them are now facing criminal charges for allegedly breaching public order, hooliganism, participation in unauthorized mass events, or threatening national security. A third problem, and that will be my last point, the recent events have evidence that restrictions on freedom of opinion and expression, which have been systemic and systematic as well in Belarus for over 2 decades, are increasingly being used to harass and intimidate journalists to the extent that their very safety is under threat. The law on mass media was amended in early 2019 to restrict further freedom of online expression, targeting specifically internet news platforms and bloggers. Whistleblowers from among medical staff were also silenced back in the spring, at the height of the government disinformation campaign about the COVID pandemic. And when following the crackdown of 9th to 12th of August, dozens of state media journalists went on strike to protest government censorship and violence. Most of them have been fired and replaced by journalists sent by Russian media. And this blackout means that people in Belarus have no access to independent information. Since August, the Independent Belarusian Association of Journalists has recorded no less than 500 cases of repression against journalists. Hundreds have been detained and dozens subjected to administrative fines or arrests, carrying it with its detention terms of up to 15 days. 6 journalists are now facing criminal charges for allegedly organizing the protests they were covering and facing punishment of up to 3 years of imprisonment. Journalists working for foreign media, with or without accreditation, have been targeted as well. And as we speak, 5 journalists are currently behind bars. So again, the problems with freedom of expression, obstruction on the work of independent media, and repression against critical journalists have been a systemic and systematic problem in Belarus for decades. What is new is that a majority of people in and out of Belarus are currently able to see the truth by themselves, thanks to online videos and pictures circulating on Telegram channels, for example. That is why the position of denial of the government of Belarus becomes more and more unsustainable, in my view. Thank you. I will answer questions during the Q&A.
Thank you very much for explaining so clearly the nature of repression and the state of human rights in Belarus. Let me turn to the next speaker, Mr. Biedroń. What is the perspective from the side of the European Parliament?
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for FEPS for inviting me. I feel so honored and so happy to be today with you and to discuss this important issue. And the view is catastrophic, if I may quote the previous speaker, because the situation in Belarus became really catastrophic. Using this term, I fully agree with Madam Rapporteur on her assessment of the situation. And we see the failure of the policy, the approachment of the European Union towards Belarus, and probably also towards Russian Federation, because while speaking about situation in Belarus, we must always remember that Belarus is a part of Limitrov policy of Russian Federation. The state of Belarus was never regarded as an independent state by Kremlin. Putin was always interested in maintaining power in Belarus, and he will do everything not to lose this power. So we always must remember that the Russian context is very important in this sense. We also talk about the last dictatorship in Europe, the country which still has death penalty in their penal code. And we also talk about the country which is led by Alexander Lukashenko for 26 years, and the country which has its borders with European Union. So while we talk about our solidarity, as European Parliament is expecting to have this solidarity from all the democratic institutions around the world, we talk about our own security. Our approach of the European Parliament is that we should remember that there won't be a stable European Union, especially countries on the eastern border of European Union, without stability in Belarus. And it's our own interest to engage. These engagements should be clever and should respect their opinion and expectations of the democratic opposition in Belarus, and taking into account including Coordination Council and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya herself. That's why European Parliament, in our recent resolutions, we underlined the importance of dialogue with Coordination Council and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, which means that our policy, which still exists, but I hope it will be a past policy of so-called critical engagement with authorities in Belarus, will be revised, and we will have new horizontal policy towards Belarus, and this is expectation of the European Parliament. And as you know, we did not recognize the recent elections in Belarus. We do not recognize Alexander Lukashenko as president of Belarus, and we do recognize Coordination Council and Svetlana Tikhanovskaya herself as our partners in dialogue on future of Belarus. Saying that we, as members of European Parliament, we expect some moves of the European institutions. The first concerns, of course, sanctions. We must remember that the sanctions are very much expected by Democratic Party in Belarus, and the imposed sanctions so far, they include 55 individuals, and we've seen these scandalous, in my opinion, discussions whether or not Alexander Lukashenko himself should be included in the sanctions. Come on. We are dealing with real catastrophic situation in Belarus, and there's no doubt that Lukashenko should be included, and is included now. So we are talking now about the third package of sanctions from the European Union, including companies and businesses, which is very important because we know that there are many businesses operating, Western businesses operating in Belarus. We have example of A1 operator, telecom operator, Austrian company, which at the very beginning was blocking access to internet for many Belarusian citizens, and this should not be a case in the future. So we expect broader sanctions, but we also expect the real financial help for Belarus, which is not the case. We know that European Union is prepared to support Belarus with 54 million of euro. Most of this money should go for fighting COVID-19 pandemic, and there is little money for supporting democratic forces in Belarus. We do not agree with this limitation of funds, especially that, as we can see, there are billions of euros transferred throughout different sources from the Russian Federation to support Lukashenko regime, especially in the context of the energy supplies. So the adequate financial support from European Union should be also applied. And we also expect that there will be international investigation on all the crimes against Belarusian citizens from Lukashenko regime. This is the expectation also of human rights defenders, not only in Belarus, but all around the world, that there will be an international investigation, and within the European Parliament, we are already working on this instrument. So in general, we as European Parliament, we are very much discontented with the current position of European Union. We expect that European Council and member states itself and European Commission will do much more in this issue, and we will follow, of course, the next steps. And I think we as international community, we should show our solidarity and maintain this wonderful spirit of uprising in Belarus, expected and not visible for so many years, and finally we have it. So it's our own responsibility to be in solidarity, and I say it coming from Poland and knowing how strong solidarity is when it's applied. So, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Biedroń. It was a very clear presentation of the position, which is not only about the rejection of a false outcome and the abuse of the power, but also clarity about who needs to be supported and how in Belarus. The third speaker is Professor Volchuk. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I will build on the presentations, and as I am basically an academic, I'll also draw on my long-standing expertise on the region, but also a wider comparison. And let's start what we've already said, but just to perhaps complete the presentations which have been said, what we've seen over the last 100 days or even before the elections is this unprecedented process, a galvanizing process for molding Belarusian identity. And we've never seen it in Belarus. So from that point of view, it's an unprecedented moment of creating a kind of political community, and with a very massive scale of crackdown and so many people detained, according to some estimates, up to 30,000 people. This is really something which affects so many people, and it will have a lasting historical effect on Belarus, that so many people are demanding, basically constitute a political community who demand democracy and human rights in a free and fair state. And yet what we've seen over the last 100 days also is what costs it entails. And Anais has outlined it so clearly. What we've seen is creation of maybe well labeled the militia state. The Lukashenko regime has lost its legitimacy, domestic and international, and it's relying by now on oppression and intimidation. And I think this is very important to basically focus on the regime side. So what we've seen is protests and massive societal mobilization, and yet this is a necessary but not a sufficient condition to overthrow the authoritarian regime, especially in the case of Belarus. So on the regime side, let's just focus what basically summarize what we've seen is this moving to outright oppression and the fact that basically the power apparatus has remained intact and has become very clearly subordinated and linked to the regime. Very often Ukraine is, basically Belarus is compared to Ukraine, to the Maidan, and I think it's a wrong analogy, wrong comparison. Perhaps just partial lessons may be useful with the Orange Revolution in Ukraine of 2004. We saw electoral fraud then, we saw mass protest, but then we also saw compromise, negotiations, and international mediations. We have not seen those basically conditions fulfilled in the case of Belarus. So this is what we've seen is actually there have been no sufficient cracks in the political regime, and we haven't seen enough defection from the Belarusian, basically Lukashenko regime, of people who wanted to avoid confrontation and bloodshed. So what we have is the regime which has managed to consolidate itself. So what the stronger parallels, however basically difficult they may be, perhaps are better with Russia in 2012 and the Bolotnaya Square protest, when people protested against electoral fraud during Putin's return to power in 2012. What we now know from Belarus, that is the power people, the whole power apparatus of the state, the law enforcement agencies, which have remained loyal to the regime, they have not been criticized by Lukashenko as before, and coercion has intensified. And with the crimes and abuses of human rights committed, which have been already outlined, this means many more people, it's just not Lukashenko, who have their back against the wall. They have nowhere else to go. So this is going to impact on the determination of the regime to basically use whatever force is needed to suppress the protest. And perhaps just a couple of sentences on the international outlook. And even though because we focus on democracy and human rights, we see those as universal values, or especially European values, but they are certainly not perceived as such. If we don't see the Belarusian protests as geopolitical, that's our choice, but they are certainly perceived differently in the case of Russia. And what we have, the protests coming on top of very complex relations between Lukashenko and Russia. Lukashenko has a stellar record of playing a cat and mouse game with Moscow and the West. And now he has become a liability and an asset as well. So this is extremely unpredictable situation. And what we've seen is Moscow has provided relatively limited assistance to Lukashenko, allowing him to stay in office, but at the same time trying to keep him vulnerable and dependent. We also see that Russia has proposed the parliamentary reforms, constitutional reforms, to introduce a parliamentary system. This is a very interesting proposal. It's worth talking about, but I will just say at this point that this is exactly against Lukashenko's interest. He wants to maintain the vertical of power, as we call it, and he wants to be the main interlocutor for Moscow. So this is the attempt to bypass may be resisted, and we know that while Lukashenko wants to maintain his absolute power, also he cannot be trusted in terms of what he does. He's notoriously unpredictable, which means for us that anything can happen and anything is possible. And for us, basically, it's the linkage between Lukashenko and the Kremlin, which will determine so much what happens in Belarus. And against this background, what is the role of the EU? And it's great to see the sanction list, and including Lukashenko and his son. And it is great to see that Svetlana Tikhanovskaya, the leader of the opposition, has been so widely received in the West, in the EU member states, institutions. Those invitations and rhetorical support is very important. But given what Anais has said and what Mr. Biedroń already outlined, this is insufficient for the Belarusian people. What we're talking is the militia state, which inflicts massive costs for the protesters. They basically employment, health, wealth, businesses, and lives are lost as a result. So what we need is a massive humanitarian assistance for basically victims of the regime. And certainly the EU, despite interest in Belarus, really genuine interest, and the coverage of the Belarusian protests has not come up with the level of support which is needed. So perhaps some wrong lessons have been learned from Ukraine, that the EU can afford to be a bystander when it comes to something which is happening just across its eastern border. And we are very happy to have the European Parliament. And I think the European Parliament is a Lisbon Treaty success story in terms of actually being so proactive when it comes to foreign policy. But we need a greater assistance, and we also need an interinstitutional task force on Belarus. So we have a joined up and coherent long-term policy on Belarus. And I will stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much also for highlighting the geopolitical dimension, which I'm sure is very important, and we couldn't really understand the situation without this. The floor is open, but I would say that the speakers could perhaps also respond to each other. But while you are considering this, let me ask a question which connects with several contributions from our viewers, who also share the view of the repression being horrendous against organizers of the demonstrations, against journalists. And the question practically is whether you can label this regime a terrorist one. I think this is an explicit question from some of the viewers we are having. Maybe you can respond to this or to each other in the first round. Dr. Marien, perhaps?
Well, as you know, in my position, I have to comply with the UN Code of Conduct and respect the principles of impartiality, objectivity, neutrality, and independence in my assessment of the situation, which is getting extremely difficult, as you can imagine, because like Mrs. Volchuk, I'm an academic. I've been working on Belarus for 12 years. So I will refrain from answering all questions that can be deemed as being politicized from the point of view of the government of Belarus and its friendly supporters, which are extremely actively contesting my mandate and its legitimacy. So I have to be careful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biedroń.
Yes, thank you very much. And I fully understand the opposition in Belarus using these strong words, because there is lots of talks but little walk. And the frustration I see is growing within the opposition, and the expectations are not has not been changed, and there are no huge expectations. We must remember that the situation, and I fully agree with Katarzyna, that there are no comparisons between situation in Ukraine and Belarus. This revolution in Belarus is nor pro-European nor pro-Russian, nor anti-European nor anti-Russian. This is a very special situation where you won't see, and we can see behind you, you won't see EU flags at the manifestations, you won't see expectation to join EU. Nevertheless, the recent opinion polls show that the willingness of integration with Russian Federation is going down among the Belarusian society, and the willingness to integrate with European Union is going up. So this is a very interesting phenomenon, but I wouldn't generalize and I wouldn't take any positions on that. I think it's too early. But what we could do is to remember that European Union, in my opinion, and opinion of many of my colleagues from delegation, should be very strong on its positions of defending the values. The values those people are put on their slogans, on the banners, they are willing to die for, and those values represent European Union. Kremlin is playing its game, but it will play its game and will not negotiate and will play this cat and mouse game as long as the European Union will be weak on its positions. And I think these weaknesses are very much visible now. So we should push us interested in this situation. European Union will defend the values. We expect that the international community will expect Belarus to respect these democratic rule of law, human rights values, and then we can find any room of negotiation. Because we can talk a lot about what we can do for Belarus, but I still think the key lies in Kremlin and in Putin's hands, and it's up to Putin to decide today about willingness of any changes in Belarus. And Lukashenko is he has never been as weak as he is now. He's very much dependent on the willingness of Putin, and very much depends on his decisions. So we also, as European Parliament, we work very closely with the European Parliament delegation in relations with Russia. We expect that our approach toward Russia of so-called selective engagement with Russian Federation will also be revised. So there are lots of expectations towards our approachment, and I think we should also find the ways of dialogue with dialogue. I call it dialogue, but from our position with the Russian Federation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If I can bring a next question from our audience, it's about the sanctions, because also in other cases, when you try to intervene and help a specific side with imposing sanctions, there is a dilemma. To what extent it is weakening the ruling elite, or to what extent it is also economically hurting the population or the economy in general. Do you think this is a relevant dilemma here in this case of Belarus? Professor Volchuk, perhaps?
Thank you. Perhaps I will come back on this issue together with the nature of the regime. And I think what one of the questions, the first question was about, is what kind of system and state do we have in Belarus? And we clearly have, we are actually out of our depths, because we haven't seen it in recent history, the state which would by now rely so much on oppression and power. And this means that basically we have, but it's still a sovereign state nominally. So we cannot say that Belarus is a terrorist state, but it's basically relying on terror, authoritarian regime relying on coercion as a key governing strategy by this stage, which means that it's very difficult for us to deal with such a system, because it's not only Mr. Lukashenko now and his immediate family. What we have is a much larger body of state officials who are engaged in basically administering oppression, from basically militia to courts and prosecutors. And what we see is the moderate forces have been marginalized, so the more economic administrative nomenclatura has been silenced effectively. So what we have is, it's an unprecedented basic collapse of legitimacy, and yet our tools are relatively limited. And I would like, I absolutely agree about the sanctions, but the sanctions at the moment target only 55 people. They need to be much more encompassing. And I very much agree about economic sanctions not being suitable. But at the same time, 70% of the Belarusian economy is state-owned. It's a very much still, in many respects, the Soviet-style command economy. And there are very, very difficult choices, because what we've seen is the economic decision-making state being basically taking a backseat and not engaging in basically any reforms, and prospect for reforms has basically been weakened significantly. So what we have is economic hardship, which is already happening, and it's coming because state-owned enterprises are not viable. So from that point of view, this is what I'm suggesting, that we need to develop this long-term comprehensive strategy for Belarus and a support package, because the sanctions as they are not going to make a difference, but at the same time, comprehensive Iran-style economic sanctions are not a a response as well. So perhaps I will stop here on this very specific nature of the Belarusian regime.
Thank you very much. Anyone something to be added on sanctions, or should we go to the next issue? Mr. Biedroń.
Just one sentence. I fully agree with the professor, and I just want to remind you that in 2016, in uncomparable situation in Belarus, the sanctions were applied against Lukashenko regime. And at this time, in completely different circumstances, less grave violations of human rights, still violations, but uncomparable to what we see now, the catastrophe we see now. The sanctions in 2016, they included 170 people, individuals, and 3 companies. And now we talk only about 55 people. So you see how weak we are in applying these policies against Lukashenko regime.
So this is a very gentle approach for the time being at this moment. But I wonder if we could speak more about the opposition, because there has been an analysis of, let's say, the ruling groups and who they are and what is their strategy. But we haven't spoken much about the opposition, how it has evolved, what kind of groups represented, and what are the political dynamics on the side of the opposition, also in view of these cycles of very harsh repression in the past period. Would you like to comment on that? Maybe Professor Wolczuk first?
Thank you. The opposition is very interesting, and the sheer concept of opposition is really tested in the case of Belarus, because we have the effectively exiled leaders of the opposition, which have emerged very recently. So we've seen this mobilization prior to elections. They have no basically long-standing, even in comparison by Russian standards, we haven't seen the network which we've seen in Russia of Mr. Navalny. So we have this relatively new group of political figures, and some of them have been detained, some of them have been in exile. And what we've seen, the other part of the opposition, this amorphous sort of protest movement, which is so bottom-up, so basically driven by individuals with no political background and basically profile, that we see almost sort of parts of Minsk being now basically coordinated action and trying to deal with oppression by fragmenting protests as such. So this leaderless nature of the protests on the ground is a strength of the system, but also it's a weakness when it comes to basically longer term planning. As usual with basically Mr. Tsikhanouskaya, she's been an incredible ambassador for Belarus. And yet what remains unclear to what extent it can be coordinated. And the prospect of the harsh winter is that the protests will peter out and the regime basically will become too oppressive. So we will be seeing innovative ways. What we know about Belarus, that Belarusians are very peaceful and they really live up to this peace-loving basically identity. And my family comes from the Polish Belarusian backgrounds, so I know that part of the world very well. Very well. They're educated, they're basically peaceful, but also their oppression does not allow them to go home in the sense and reconcile themselves with the regime. So most likely what we'll see is basically innovative approach, as we've already seen, to the protests, to opposition. This issue is not going to go away, but we do not necessarily have the sort of political strategy in place, because it's almost impossible to have it for the opposition leaders, who are very well-meaning, but also dealing with an unprecedented situation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. May I come back with a question to Dr. Marin? What do you think ourselves in Brussels could do more to make the human rights situation better understood? Because I think for a lot of people, these developments in the last 4 months is practically TV news, and probably mixed with news from various other unstable countries. But probably, sharing a border with the European Union, the situation in Belarus matters a lot. And even if we don't compare it to some previous cases, this should be seen as a development of great significance. What can be done to explain it better to the European public? What is the state of human rights in Belarus?
Thank you. Well, even though I'm a European myself, and the mandate I hold has been established at the initiative of the European Union, again, as an independent expert with the UN, which is an organization with hundreds of states and a minority of democracies, and a minority living away from, far away from Europe, it's not an easy question for me to address. I would just echo what Professor Volchuk has said, that the humanitarian dimension remains extremely important. And I believe that the concerned states, which are willing and able to help, or organizations, and of course then I'm thinking about the EU, should do more to support the victims of human rights violations. But in retrospect, I believe that the events of the past months and the way they have been on the front stage of international media has finally put some attention on Belarus, which for many countries in the world was just a black spot. Some people thought it was even in a part of Russia. So I think there is a necessity for indeed pedagogy to explain that the Belarusian mobilization that we have seen is genuine, that it's grassroots, that it is legitimate in terms of aspirations for democracy and human rights. And given the fact that we know how the events are being portrayed both in Belarusian state media and in Russian media, national ones and propagandistic ones, I think it is extremely important to highlight the fact that the mobilization is popular, and it's not manipulated from abroad. And here, I'm sure Mr. Biedron will understand what I mean. I mean, I live myself in Poland, and the Belarusian state media tend to put the responsibility for these for the protests on neighboring states, on Lithuania and Belarus being supposedly marionettist, manipulating the crowds, etc. This could not be more false. I mean, there is absolutely no evidence of any kind of interference of that kind. However, and this will echo what Professor Volchuk said earlier as well regarding the opposition. When we call for a dialogue with civil society, and that is of course inclusive of the opposition and the leaders or of the current movement and the current protests and the current attempt at putting Belarus back on the European map, we have to remember that the government of Belarus does not recognize at all Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya, and ever since she actually left the country in August, they have been very successful attempts at portraying her as somebody from the diaspora now, a refugee, or like outside of the country, and therefore with no legitimacy to get involved in the solving of the crisis. However, I believe that one way or another, those who have taken the lead now, even if from abroad, should be invited to the negotiation table and involved in this mediation, because Mrs. Tsikhanouskaya in particular has been carrying the aspirations of the protesters. But again, she's not able to control them. And this is why she has been disqualified by official discourses in Belarus, saying when she will be able to stop the protest, to tell people to go to stay home and we can sit down and talk, then she can be a legitimate interlocutor. But this is not the case, and she's actually following in her statements what is being done by the protesters themselves in a very new fashion of mobilization through social networks and Telegram, etc. But therefore, in the eyes of the authorities, she remains lže Dmitry, you know, this a false Dmitry, somebody who is not seen as a legitimate interlocutor. So we are in a sort of a dead-end situation here.
I see. Thank you very much also for mentioning the humanitarian dimension. Mr. Biedron, is the European Parliament thinking about more humanitarian support to somehow promote this?
Yes, thank you for this question. And if I may add about the opposition democratic side in Belarus, what is important is that also it's a female revolution. In the front of this revolution are women, which is an exceptional thing, especially in this part of Europe. It was usually the men were the leaders. I come from Poland, and like Walesa figure was very important, and women, even though they were playing important role, they were not on the front, on the cover of the magazines, etc., etc. And you now see the three leaders, Svetlana Cichanowska, Maria Kolesnikova, and Weronika Tsepkalo, as three leaders of this opposition. And I must remind you that one of the symbolic things, but I think very important, was the Sakharov Prize. This year's Sakharov Prize of European Parliament goes to Belarusian opposition, with including the women in front of this revolution and democratic opposition. So I think this is a very important also instrument. Concerning the humanitarian aid, I said at the very beginning that the European Union is preparing the instruments and already putting in place some part of it, of 54 million euro, which will be devoted to fight coronavirus pandemic, and few million supporting democratic side like media, NGOs, and so on. But in my opinion, and opinion of majority of my colleagues, and I think also voiced by many opposition leaders in Belarus, this is not a sufficient help, especially that this help is uncomparable to what Kremlin is doing. And also I must remind you that within our resolution, we underline the importance of international donors conference, which could be organized. We have examples from many countries, from many situations where these international donors conferences were organized, collecting money from the international community, private sources, and also state and international sources to support changes. And this is still not the case in the context of Belarus. And to our disappointment, nothing has been done. We have declarations of individual states willing to extend its humanitarian willingness, but it's not being coordinated, it's not being supported seriously by European Union. And to our disappointment, and we will push on changing this position, because there is much more help for Belarus needed now.
Thank you very much. We are getting close to the end of this program, but we are also getting close to the end of 2020. And at the end of the year, we often go to predictions or pledges. I don't want to push you either into predictions or pledges, but why don't you share with us finally some thoughts about how to shape the expectations, and what do you think should be the most important be focused on in the next few months? Maybe we can start with Dr. Marine, and then close the conversation, let's say, with 1 minute interventions from each of you.
Thank you. Well, I have no crystal ball. I'm usually an optimistic, but I'm getting more and more pessimistic, to be honest. I think it's based on the realistic assessment of the situation that Professor Wolczuk has very well reminded, that even if we were to consider the political crisis in Belarus as an internal affair, which I don't, because human rights are of concern for the international community, given the geopolitical context, not everything can be solved easily, and I don't see any willingness now on the part of the government of Belarus to go towards some dialogue or mediation, and even the talks about a constitutional reform, from what I can see now, can be just a diversionary tactic. If you allow me just to come back on the issue of humanitarian aid, not everything costs a lot of money. In fact, when you take into consideration the fact that so many students have been expelled from university or suffering some different sorts of repression, and that given on the other hand that online is a new normal worldwide now, I think it would be worse for universities in other countries, and here I call on the rectors of universities, so it doesn't have to be a governmental decision, to open access to their online seminars for free for Belarusian students who are staying in Belarus, because any kind of support, even a humanitarian corridor, which would lead to a massive exile of Belarusians, might not be sustainable either for welcoming states or for the future of Belarus itself. And therefore, any initiatives that would support students who are ready to stay at home but would like to get a more open approach on especially human sciences, social sciences, which don't exist at this point in Belarus, would be useful, and bearing in mind also that Belarus at what point hopefully will join the Bologna process, then these students should be given an opportunity to gain some credits already by following the courses made available for them. So that would be my call as an academic. Thank you.
Thank you very much for explaining the opportunities in education cooperation. Professor Wolczuk, what would you like to add?
I very much agree. This sounds like an excellent basically idea, and what we need is support for all professional groups with basically people's livelihoods, businesses, health and medical bills, as well as financial support is needed. So we definitely need this sort of donors conference that to take place and coordinate, because one of the danger is if we have a lot of fragmented assistance, there's a lot of duplication and inefficiency. So coordination and strategy is needed. We also need support for the independent media. This has become such an important part, even with equipment, but also financing for rather costly, basically, equipment. That would be great as well. One of the questions was asked about the Eastern Partnership and contribution. I'm not sure if it has happened, but from the Eastern Partnership, if there are any basically assistance and cooperation with the law enforcement agencies from Belarus power ministries, this, in my view, should have been suspended already. So there is a lot that can be done. And when thinking about pledges, I think the EU has already created expectations by talking about democracy and human rights. And now it's basically, do we just talk the talk, or do we walk the walk as well? And this is a real test, and it will have long-term consequences for the EU as a foreign policy actor, and especially in the Eastern neighborhood. So it's a really sort of litmus test what Belarus does, if anything, in order for the EU to live up to the expectation it has already created in terms of being a force for good on the European continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. Biedron, you have the final words in this panel in 1 minute, please.
Thank you very much. I think the situation is bittersweet, and both scenarios of development are in direction of more bitterness or sweetness are expected. And unfortunately, it's a geopolitical decision, and it's not much about what we are talking here, but it's much more complex political decision and willingness of international community to go into confrontation, serious confrontation with Russian Federation. Because as we see now is the hybrid integration with Russian Federation. And in my opinion, if we want to take strong positions, this hybrid integration with Russian Federation will proceed. And this is a danger. What is unstoppable is this big dream of Belarusian society to be sovereign and independent state. And it's again up to us whether we are able to help them maintain it or not. And I've seen the question of trade unions. I think, and coming from the country where the trade unions has made together with the intelligentsia, the revolution in Poland, I think also it's very important that we will remember about the workers and their bravery and the dependence of the economical dependence of the regime, and this solidarity is also needed from the trade unions, international community with their colleagues in Belarus. But I'm sure the society, the leaders are unstoppable. There is a huge sense of unification of the society against the regime, at least a huge part of the society. And I think our responsibility of international community is to listen to the demands, expectations from the Coordination Council and the leaders, and to answer as broadly as we can to these demands, and to, in my opinion, and I fully agree with my colleagues, we can do much, much more. And this is a shameful thing that we are here to talk about that, but how soon it will change. Żyje Belarus.
Indeed. Thank you very much for all three of you for the extremely valuable presentations today. And there is no need for a summary from my side. I think there's been a very clear discussion pointing to the same direction from all three panelists. We heard about understanding, solidarity, and support, which should not simply be a question of monitoring the situation, but practice if possible. I also should add that when the European Union is launching a big discussion, a conference on the future of Europe, probably should not only look into the matters of the 27 existing member states, but also to our neighborhood to get the full picture and to help shaping our future together. Thanks again to speakers as well as the viewers today, and I hope to see you all on future FEPS events in 2020, but also in 2021. Thank you again. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.